A colleague once said that there can be no climate justice without racial justice, and there can be no racial justice without climate justice. Today's event, combining both topics of climate and race, is not only fitting, but vital if we are to address both of these issues, as they are very much linked together. This morning, I've been asked to speak about Bridgewater's commitment to addressing racism in policies, programs, and services. And that could actually be done with a very simple statement that, yes, in fact, we will work with the Anti-Racism Taskforce to ensure that we do just that. The reality is, however, that this is something that goes deeper and is far more complex. It will take time, result in difficult and perhaps painful discussions, but it is something that must happen. Our world depends on it. Now, that statement might give you pause for a moment. Our world depends on it. In the time I have this morning, I hope to give you a better understanding on why that is. But first, I need to take you back to May 25th and the 8 minutes and 46 seconds that finally awakened the world to something many of us could not, or at least chose not to see, but sadly, many here today experience on a far too often basis, and that is the targeting of a person of color for no other reason than the color of their skin. For me, the death of George Floyd was a wake-up call. A wake-up call not only to what is happening in the United States, but what is happening in Canada, and make no mistake, happening in every community. The news this summer from Chester Basin shines a bright spotlight on this issue locally as just one example. Hearing from speakers at our own Take a Knee event, excuse me, a few months ago, and what they faced day in and day out became a moment where we could either, as Francis Kangata said that day, check a box, say we did something and move on, or we could take steps to bring about real lasting change. In the months since that Take a Knee event, I've worked with various national and international committees, and what's been at the forefront of many discussions is the direct link between race and climate change. This is something that is finally resonating with decision makers globally. Well, not all decision makers, but on January 20th, that should change. The global movement for racial justice has grown in the context of the coronavirus pandemic. This has highlighted the massive health disparities along racial lines. Not only are people of color facing racism person to person through words and actions, but science is now demonstrating that they're facing racism when it comes to climate change and health. This is where the link here in Bridgewater with Energize Bridgewater and the Anti-Racism Taskforce is important. The climate crisis is indistinguishably linked to racial justice. To quote US environmental advocate Hop Hopkins, "We're in this mess because we have declared parts of our planet disposable. You can't have climate change without sacrifice zones, and you can't have sacrifice zones without disposable people, and you can't have disposable people without racism." When Canada or any other nation pours carbon pollution into the air, knowing that people in countries that have contributed much less to the climate crisis will face the worst of the consequences, that is racism. Nothing seems to illustrate that point as powerfully as when you look at one of the many charts of CO2 emissions per capita alongside the Climate Change Vulnerability Index. Countries like the United States, Canada, and Australia are the worst offenders for CO2, while the majority of Africa or South America produce the least CO2 per capita. Looking at these indexes, it becomes clear that environmental injustice is a problem on a global scale. Nations that have done the least to cause the climate crisis are facing the most severe impacts from the climate crisis. And more often than not, it is white majority populations that are doing the biggest damage, and Black, Brown, and Indigenous people who will face the effects. Given the way that racism infects all of society, it is no surprise to find environmental injustice evidence at the local level. A study at the University of Minnesota found that white people were exposed to around 17% less pollution than they created, while Black people were exposed to 56% more pollution than they created, and Hispanic people to 63% more. Going over to across the Atlantic, research in England has found that the worst levels of air pollution are seen in neighborhoods where more than 20% of the population are non-white. Now, you may be asking what this has to do with Bridgewater, and I believe that a global crisis cannot be fully separated from a local issue, and because of that, we have an obligation on two fronts. The first is to ensure our policies, programs, and services are not presenting barriers to anyone. To ensure that is in fact the case, the Anti-Racism Taskforce, which is an official committee of the town, will be able to bring these directly to town council to action. The second is to use our voice regionally, provincially, as well as nationally and internationally, to advocate for change and justice. Now, those who know me will know I'm a firm believer that Bridgewater has a role to play on the world stage. And while that may sound almost laughable to some, being a town of under 9,000 people, we already sit around some big global tables on various issues. This means that we have a very real opportunity to help change the world. And that is more important now than ever before. The COVID-19 pandemic has exposed longstanding inequalities and suffering on communities that were already vulnerable. These drivers of social injustice are the same drivers behind the environmental breakdown. As Rihanna Gunn Wright, who is one of the lead architects of the Green New Deal in the US, said, the people most likely to die from toxic fumes are the same people most likely to die from COVID-19. It's like we are watching a preview of the worst possible impacts of the climate crisis roll right before our eyes. In other words, the current health crisis underscores the rationale for treating the environment, health, and social justice as interlinked. Now, this may seem like a lot. Trying to tackle economic inequality, racial injustice, funding for public services, and arguing for a new economic model all in one package may seem like taking on too many battles at once. But things are starting to change. From the way the COVID crisis has hit the poorest hardest, and science-denying leaders continue to block action on climate change, to the huge global movement for racial justice, public opinion has shifted so that there is no appetite among the majority of people for a return to business as usual. Instead, we need to build back better. This will require a shift in mindset with how we look at the very measurement of success. The reality we live in is that economic success equals political success. And so there's little incentive for decision and policymakers to change. So much of what we do is measured through a prism of economic growth that has been the biggest barrier to tackling both inequality and the climate breakdown. In fact, one of the biggest things contributing to the failure to tackle prevailing racism society. In many ways, it has made it impossible for many countries to convince people that there can be a different way than what we're doing now. We know that this current economic model, in addition to creating and aggravating inequalities and stimulating the pending environmental catastrophe, is simply wrong. The concept that real world success of everyday citizens can be measured by a GDP chart that must always move up and to the right makes little sense. In effect, we have been trying to force people into an economic system that benefits a tiny minority, rather than building societies that meet the needs of everyone, values nature, and protects the ecosystem that supports all life. We are all worse off as a result because inequality weakens society and so damages everyone. But the biggest losers have been disproportionately than people of color in every country. And this is why I'm anxious and excited to move Bridgewater to the model of the donut economy. Now, before I lose some of you with some preconceived notions of a socialist or communist system where the government pays for everything, let me assure you that this is not what this is. Donut economics is really a fascinatingly different way to look at things. And I'll try to explain it quickly in the time that I have, but I know a lot of it will be lost over video. So if you're interested, I would highly recommend Googling or picking up Kate Rayworth's book, which is simply called Donut Economics. And Kate is the author and also the inventor of donut economics. So I want you to picture a donut, like literally a plain old-fashioned donut. The body of the donut itself is that safe and just space for all of humanity to live within. Inside the donut hole are things like housing, gender and racial equality, social equity, food, water, and more. If we move too far from the body of the donut into the center on any one of those items, it shows a shortfall there, and that people are lacking in those areas. On the outside of the donut, we have things like climate change, pollution, and biodiversity loss. Moving too far to the outside means we've contributed too much to these. Now, I'm oversimplifying it, but the bottom line is that every single person on Earth is entitled to live in that ring, the body of the donut, of that safe and just space. And our success needs to be measured on that, not simply on how many things a country bought or sold to another one. The rapid and dramatic reshaping of our society over the past few months has opened a space to challenge assumptions about what is possible. Projects like Energize Bridgewater and committees like the Anti-Racism Taskforce are important pieces to a puzzle that for too long has been left only to those directly impacted by them to put together. These are undoubtedly crucial times. We are already on the edge of descending into a runaway climate breakdown, and the COVID pandemic has revealed even more acutely how fragile human civilization is. Now, a rapidly growing movement for social justice has reminded us all of the deep and damaging inequalities in our societies. If there ever was a time to say what we are doing now isn't working, so let's try something different, that time is now. And so that brings me back to where I started, that there can be no climate justice without racial justice, and there can be no racial justice without climate justice. So I hope you now understand a little bit better how they're linked and that the two can't be separated. As the saying goes, you cannot unring a bell. It's up to us, no matter where we are, to bring about the changes that have for too long been denied. Bridgewater has begun to take those important first steps with both the anti-racism task force taking shape and the Energize Bridgewater project coming online. So as I close this morning, I want to challenge everyone here today to take those same first steps, either with us if you live in Bridgewater, or by challenging the leadership in the community that you live in to take the real steps or take steps towards real lasting change. In the words of Helen Keller, alone we can do so little, but together we can do so much. Thank you.